Hello, and welcome to Fear Noir. Before we begin, take a moment to leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from. I always enjoy reading them. If you enjoy slow, unsettling stories that gently draw you deeper into the darkness, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Now, get comfortable, let your body settle into stillness, and allow the outside world to quietly fade into silence. Tonight, the darkness has a story waiting for you, so close your eyes, listen carefully, and let yourself drift into Fear Noir. Story 1. 2 weeks ago, someone found a dead body in a cave only a few blocks from where we grew up. I got the news the day before Easter, in a text from my little brother Jacob. I was at the airport, sitting under those bright, harsh lights, waiting for my flight out of Georgia. I go to school down there, and I was flying back home to Kentucky for spring break. The terminal was loud and ordinary, rolling suitcases, boarding announcements, people laughing into phones, and the message on my screen felt like it belonged to a different world. Jacob said the man hadn't been identified yet. A local couple found him early Saturday morning, stuffed deep inside a passage everyone calls first date. Jacob wrote like it was gossip, like the kind of thing you tell someone because you know it'll make their skin crawl. He said the police didn't see any signs of a struggle or violence. It looked like a straight-up accident, the kind that happens when somebody gets too confident and goes farther than they should. Someone squeezes into a tight place thinking, I've done this before, I can handle it, and then the cave reminds them who's in charge. The thing about our town is that it's small enough that news doesn't just travel fast, it sticks. It sits on front porches and in diner booths and in the pauses between sentences at church. Everybody knows everybody, or knows somebody who knows somebody, and the caves are part of that. Not the tourist kind, not the polished lit-up kind. Real caves, wet rock, cold air, tight spaces. We have this little stubborn group of people who love crawling around underground, and the center of that world is a system we call needle caves. Needle caves aren't Mammoth Cave, not even close. Nothing around here is. Mammoth is the pride of the state, the big name, the place you take relatives from out of town. Needle caves are smaller, rougher, more private, but they're still full of routes and chambers and narrow throats that make you feel like you're being swallowed. People who get into it act like it's a secret, even though it's not much of one. If you grew up here, you heard about needle caves before you were old enough to drive. When I got home that evening, Jacob didn't even let me put my bag down properly before he started talking. He kept his voice low, like the walls might listen. At some point, he told me to grab my headlamp. He had that look on his face that always means trouble, the same look he used to get when he was 12 and dared himself to jump off the high rocks into the creek. He led me out after dark, not along the main paths, but the shortcuts kids learn, through back lots, between trees, over patches of uneven ground. The air had that early spring bite to it. Everything smelled like wet soil and old leaves waking up again. He said there was still one entrance the police hadn't blocked off. I should have said no. I should have reminded him that somebody had died in there. But part of me was curious in a way I didn't want to admit, and part of me felt responsible for Jacob. Like if he was going to do something stupid, I needed to at least be there. The main chamber of Needle Caves is the kind of place people fall in love with the first time they see it. The ceiling rises high above you, and the rock is full of hanging formations that look like teeth or frozen drips. There are spots where the stone is smooth enough that people lie down and turn their lights off and just stare up, listening to their own breathing. Your voice echoes differently in there. Even a whisper feels like it travels and comes back older. First Date is tucked behind a huge limestone pillar at the back of that chamber. You wouldn't notice it if you didn't know where to look. The entrance looks friendly at first, almost inviting. The floor is oddly flat compared to everything else, and the mouth is wide enough that it feels like a normal hallway. That's why people call it First Date, I think. It's the kind of passage you take somebody into when you want to show off, but not scare them. It gives you a false sense of safety, but the farther you go, the more the walls start to lean in. The passage narrows bit by bit, quietly, like it's trying not to alert you. Eventually, it gets so tight that even kids can't squeeze through. People call that point the choke or the pinch point, like the cave is literally pinching shut. There are stories that after that tight spot, the passage opens into a small room. Most maps show it, like a little bubble beyond the neck of the corridor. But as far as I knew, nobody had ever actually made it through the choke point and come back to prove it. That night, the entrance to the area was blocked with caution tape in the laziest way imaginable. It hung there like decoration. We ducked under it, careful not to tear it, as if that would make us less guilty. As we moved deeper, we heard voices echoing from somewhere ahead. More than one voice, a handful at least. I couldn't make out words, just the shape of people talking. It sounded wrong in a place like that, like a radio left on in an empty house. We stepped into the main chamber and stopped. I aimed my light around, expecting to see cops or maybe someone from search and rescue, but there was nobody. It felt like the voices had been there 1 second and then vanished, leaving only the cave's quiet breathing behind. Jacob acted like it was nothing and started toward the pillar like he knew exactly what we were going to see. I followed, and when I leaned in and looked down First Date, my stomach tightened so hard it made me dizzy. The body was there, wedged sideways deep in the passage, maybe 10 meters back. He wasn't lying down. He was held upright by the rock itself, pinned so tightly it didn't even look possible. The limestone pressed against his face in a way that pulled his skin tight. It made his mouth look stretched, almost like a grin you'd see on a cartoon, except nothing about it was funny. His eyes were open, staring straight toward the entrance, as if he'd died looking at the way out. There was something unreal about the view. The jagged frame of rock around him made it feel like I was looking into a toy viewer, like one of those old Viewmasters where you click and a picture pops up. Except the picture was a dead man in a hole in the earth. And he wasn't a picture. He was there. He was stuck. He was silent. I swallowed hard and tried to make my voice casual, which came out as shaky instead. I asked Jacob if the cops were really just going to leave him there forever. Jacob shrugged. He told me search and rescue had tried to get the body out already and failed. The man was jammed deeper than anyone expected, and it wasn't as simple as tying a rope around him and pulling. The cave didn't give you space to work. The angles were wrong. The rock had him in a lock. Jacob said authorities were still trying to figure out how to do it without hurting anyone else. And this was the first death anyone could remember in needle caves. So nobody had a routine for it. The man didn't seem to have family in town pushing for answers either, which meant everything moved slower. We left after that, and I tried to pretend I could set the image down like a heavy box and walk away. But it followed me. I kept seeing that face, that stare, the way the stone made his expression look almost intentional, like the cave had arranged him. On Tuesday evening, my parents sent me out to round up my younger siblings for dinner. Jacob wasn't answering his phone. I called, and it went straight to voicemail. I called again, and it did the same thing. At first, I figured he was doing what he always does, hanging out somewhere he shouldn't, with kids who thought being reckless was a personality. I didn't want to admit it, but I knew exactly where he was. When I got back to the cavern, I saw 5 of Jacob's friends gathered near the entrance to First Date. They were trying to act casual, but their faces gave them away. They shifted around like they'd been caught stealing. When they saw me, they went quiet, and one of them actually looked down at his shoes. Then I heard Jacob's voice from inside the passage, excited and sharp. He was deeper in First Date than he had any business being. I moved closer, and my light caught the narrow corridor. Jacob was in there, shoulders hunched, dragging himself forward with his elbows and knees like he'd done it 100 times. He was close, too close. By my guess, he was only a couple of arm lengths from the body. He called back to his friends about how close he was, bragging like it was some kind of dare. He said he could almost touch the corpse. His friends laughed in that nervous way people laugh when something is disgusting, but they don't want to admit it. I didn't yell at him right there in front of them, but my teeth were clenched. I waited until he started wriggling back out, and on the walk home I let him have it. I told him it wasn't just disrespectful, it was dangerous. I told him there were diseases, bacteria, things you couldn't see, that didn't care if he thought he was tough. Jacob rolled his eyes and acted like I was being dramatic, but I saw his hands shaking a little when he tried to hide them in his pockets. Before we left the cave, I stepped toward the mouth of First Date to help guide him out. My light swept over the interior, and something about it made my skin go cold. The corpse looked farther back than it had 2 days ago. At first, I told myself it was the angle, or shadows, or my brain playing games. The cave messes with your sense of distance, but the man's face looked different too. When I first saw him, the stone pulled his skin back toward his ears, like a forced smile. Now his cheeks looked bunched toward his nose, and his lips were pushed forward in a small pout, like he'd been pressing his mouth against the rock. The whole expression was wrong, like the pressure on his face had changed. It didn't look like he'd died trying to crawl out anymore. It looked like he'd died trying to move deeper in, like he'd been backing away from the exit. When Jacob finally scrambled free, breathing hard and laughing, I asked the group if anyone had touched the body. I said it as calmly as I could, but the question came out sharp. If they'd shoved it deeper as a prank, it would explain it, horrible as that was. They all denied it immediately. One of them suggested that the body had shifted because it was bloating, expanding in the heat of rot and pushing against the rock. That sounded gross, but it also sounded possible. I wanted to believe it. Before we left, Jacob mentioned that the police were finally getting ready to do a full recovery, and that needle caves would be blocked off completely the next morning. He said it like it was exciting news, like a show was about to start. At around 2 a.m. Wednesday morning, I woke up to Jacob moving around in the dark. We share a room, and he was pulling on clothes like he was trying not to make noise, but wasn't doing a great job. I whispered his name and asked what he was doing. He told me he'd lost his phone in first date. He said it must have slipped out of his pocket when he was crawling. Now, he was sure the police or search and rescue would find it during the cleanup. He wasn't worried about the phone itself as much as what it would mean. He was terrified our parents would find out he'd been in there after the body was discovered. He was terrified he'd get in trouble for trespassing on what was basically a crime scene. I was exhausted and annoyed and still half asleep, but I also knew Jacob. If I didn't go with him, he might go alone. And that idea made my stomach flip. So I told him I'd get it. I was older, faster in tight places, and if anyone caught us, I'd rather it be me. Jacob tried to argue, but it was weak. More guilt than resistance. By 3 a.m., I was back at the chamber with my headlamp, a mask pulled over my face, and a reach extender tool in my hand. The kind people use to pick up trash without bending over. The cave felt different at night, even though it was always dark inside. Maybe it was the knowledge that most of the town was asleep, that the surface world was quiet while I was stepping into rock and shadow. As I moved in, I heard voices again. They came from ahead, from the darkness near the pillar, and they made me freeze. I turned my lamp off and stood still, letting my eyes adjust to almost nothing. The voices were low, overlapping, and I couldn't understand a single word. It hit me then, clear as a slap, that it didn't sound like English. It sounded like a language I didn't recognize at all, and the fact that I couldn't separate one voice from another made it worse, like the cave itself was murmuring. I kept my light off and moved along the wall with my hands, slow and careful. Every scrape of my shoe felt too loud. I listened for breathing, for footsteps, for anything that would tell me I wasn't alone. The voices drifted in and out, like they were coming from a place where sound didn't travel cleanly. Then I heard one last cluster of whispers, and after that there was a sudden silence so sharp it felt planned. I waited, holding my breath, and then I flicked my lamp back on. The corpse was still there, in first date. I could see it right away, and I could also see Jacob's phone lying on the ground a few feet from the choke point, close enough to make my heart lift with relief and sink with dread. At the same time, it was within reach technically, but only if I got close to the body. Too close. I told myself to be practical. I had the reach tool. I'd just slide in, grab the phone, and slide out. No drama, no hero moments. Just in and out. I stepped into first date, and for the first few seconds it really did feel like a hallway. The floor was flat and easy, then the walls began to narrow and my shoulders brushed stone. A few feet later, the rock pressed against my chest and spine, and that old panic rose up, the animal part of the brain that hates being trapped. I forced myself to breathe slowly, but the air tasted wrong. The smell hit me fully as I went deeper. Rot. Thick, sweet in a sick way, like something spoiled left out in the sun. It coated the back of my throat. I pulled my mask tighter, but it didn't do much. The stink was in the air itself, in the dampness. Then I saw something move. It was subtle, just a flicker, but it was enough to make my body lock up. I stared ahead, and my light landed on the man's face. The gray skin looked waxy, stretched and dull. For a long moment nothing happened, and I told myself it was my nerves. Caves play tricks. The mind fills in movement where there is none. I stood there until my muscles started to ache, listening so hard I could hear my own heartbeat. Nothing. I forced my legs to shuffle forward, one tiny push at a time, until I was close enough to use the reach extender. The phone was on its side, screen down, half dusty. I stretched the tool out. The first try missed. The second try just nudged it. My breathing got faster, and I hated how loud it sounded in the tight space. On the third try, the tongs clamped around the phone with a soft click. I started pulling it toward me. That's when I heard the shuffling sound. It was behind the body, deeper in, like stone scraping stone. I snapped my head up, and my light bounced across the corpse. For half a second, nothing changed. Then, the body began to shudder. It wasn't the small twitch of settling weight. It was a real movement, as if something had grabbed it. The torso lurched forward violently. The man's head snapped down toward his chest with a sound that made me flinch, even though I couldn't hear it clearly. The motion was so sudden, I thought the body was collapsing in on itself. And then, just as fast, it was yanked backward through the choke point. For one stunned second, my brain tried to make sense of it in normal terms. Maybe a rope. Maybe search and rescue had finally come in. Maybe this was the recovery, and I was about to get caught in the dumbest way possible. But there were no voices calling directions, no flash of official lights, no boots. Just that pulling force, patient and brutal, dragging dead weight into a space too small to accept it. When the swollen middle hit the narrowest point of rock, the body split open like overripe fruit. I saw the tear happen. I saw the skin part and dark wet matter bulge out, forced by pressure, sliding as the corpse was hauled through the gap anyway. The smell became unbearable, so strong it felt like it was filling my mouth. I gagged into my mask and tried not to choke. The face was the last thing to go, squeezed and scraped by stone. In the last instant before it vanished, the eyes seemed to shift in my direction. I know that sounds impossible. I know what a dead body is. But the look felt real, and it felt like begging. Then the corpse was gone, vacuumed into the space beyond. I stared at the empty pinch point, my light fixed on the spot where the body had been. My hands shook so badly, the beam wobbled. For a moment, I thought I was alone again, that whatever did that was already gone. Then I saw them on the other side of the choke point. In the cramped space beyond, 3 men stood huddled together in the dimness. They looked like they belonged to the cave. Their clothes were filthy, packed with dirt like they'd been crawling for days. Their hair hung in stiff gray ropes, like it had been matted by water and grime, until it stopped being hair and became something else. Their faces were smeared, their skin the wrong color in my light, and their eyes caught the beam and held it. The one closest to the gap met my stare and grinned. It was a bad grin, all jagged yellow teeth, like a dog showing what it could do. My body moved before my thoughts caught up. I began sliding backward toward the entrance as fast as the rock allowed, pushing with my elbows, trying not to snag my clothes or panic so hard I froze. The man's grin widened. He made a sound that was either laughter or something close to it, and then he disappeared from view for a second. He came back holding a long metal rod, like a piece of rebar, rusty and dark. He shoved it through the choke point, pushing the sharpened end toward me like a spear. The tip scraped the stone near my shoulder. I jerked away so hard my elbow slammed rock and sent a hot shock up my arm. He thrust again, and again he fell just short. He said something over his shoulder in that same foreign language, short and quick. The other two men shifted, and then all three of them backed away and scattered into the darkness behind the choke point, melting into it like they'd never been there at all. I didn't wait to see if they'd come back. I dragged myself out of first date in a blur of fear, scraping my knees and forearms raw. Once I reached open space, I ran, half stumbling in the dark, climbing faster than I ever had, slipping on damp stone, slamming my shoulder once, and barely feeling it. The cave felt like it was chasing me, like the air itself wanted me gone. By the time I got home, I was covered in dirt and fresh scrapes. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. Jacob sat up when I came in, and I threw his phone at him like it was a poisonous thing. I told him what I saw, stumbling over my words. I expected him to laugh or call me dramatic, but Jacob's face went pale in the dark. He didn't look amused. He looked scared in a way I hadn't seen since we were kids. Later that morning, after the sun came up and the world started pretending it was normal again, I went to the police station and told them everything. I described the voices. I described the way the corpse was dragged backward through the choke point. I described the three men, the filth on their clothes, the rebar spear. The officer I spoke to watched me the whole time with a flat, irritated expression. When I finished, he didn't ask for details the way I thought he would. He told me not to waste his time with pranks. He said search and rescue had recovered the body hours ago. I walked out of the station feeling like I'd stepped into someone else's life. I sat in my car and stared at the steering wheel, trying to line up what I knew with what he'd said. My mind kept replaying that moment. The corpse splitting, the men grinning in the choke point like it was a doorway they owned. Later that day, I called again, hoping I'd get someone different, someone who'd take me seriously. The answer didn't change. The body and first date had been recovered that morning, they said. Needle Caves would reopen soon. It made no sense. The people I saw weren't police. They didn't move like trained rescuers. They didn't have gear, or radios or helmets. And even if they were somehow part of the recovery team, how could they be on the other side of the choke point? That gap was famously too tight. People came to first date to see where the passage stopped, to press their hands against the narrowing rock and joke about how it looked like the cave was closing its fist. Nobody I'd ever met could fit through that pinch point. Most maps show a small chamber beyond it, and that had always been the mystery. That's what people talked about. They'd say, maybe it opens up back there. Maybe it leads somewhere bigger. Maybe there's a way around. Maybe someone could dig. But seeing those men standing there made the map feel like a lie, or like the map only showed what we were allowed to know. I can't stop thinking that there's more than a small chamber on the other side. There has to be another passage, something that lets people come and go without using the main entrances. Maybe it climbs upward to a hidden opening somewhere in the woods. Maybe it runs deeper into an unmapped maze, where the rock goes on and no one's ever bothered to chart it because no one's ever come back with proof. Or maybe the proof was there the whole time and we just didn't see it. Of course, my friends say I hallucinated. They say lack of sleep, stress, the smell, the tight space, my brain turning shadows into monsters. I can't completely rule it out. Strange things happen underground. Your senses get messed up. The dark makes you desperate for patterns. But I've been in caves before. I've crawled through first date a few times in the past. I've never seen anything like that. I don't have a history of seeing things. I wasn't drunk. I wasn't high. I was scared, sure, but fear doesn't invent metal scraping stone or three separate bodies moving in a space that should have been empty. When the semester ends, I'm going back to Kentucky for the summer. Jacob and I have already talked about going back to Needle Caves, not to crawl into first date again like idiots, but to try something safer. We want to get video of what's beyond the choke point with a little RC rover. Something small enough to fit through tight places. If there really is another chamber, another passage, another anything, we'll see it on camera. We'll have proof that doesn't depend on my word against a bored officers. Until then, I'm trying to live like a normal person. I go to class. I do homework. I eat meals. I joke with people who have no idea what's sitting behind my eyes. But every time I'm alone in a quiet room, I think about those faces crusted with dirt and the way they smiled at me from a place that was supposed to be a dead end, a chamber with no known entrance, no known exit, and no reason for anyone to be there at all. Quick update, April 21. It finally hit me that if there really were people speaking on the other side of first date, then Jacob's friends might have heard something too. They're in those caves all the time. They know what normal echo sounds like, and they know when voices don't belong. I told Jacob to text them and ask directly if they heard anything weird that Sunday night when they were passing through the main chamber. Most of them said no. A couple of them joked about ghosts and told him to stop messing around, but two of them said something that made my stomach drop. They said that on Sunday night, when they walked through the main chamber, they thought they heard someone speaking a foreign language somewhere nearby. They didn't think much of it at the time. They assumed it was tourists in some adjacent passage, maybe people from out of town exploring with a guide. It's not solid proof. It's not enough to show the police. It's not even enough to convince someone who already thinks I made it up. But it's something. It's a small point in the column that says I didn't imagine all of it. And if I didn't imagine it, then the worst part isn't what I saw in first date that night. The worst part is what it means could still be there, waiting on the other side of the rock, listening to our voices echo through the dark. Story 2. I moved into my second-floor apartment 2 weeks ago, and it still doesn't feel like mine. It's the kind of place that looks like someone hit pause halfway through moving in. A desk, my PC, a camping chair that creaks when I lean back, and an air mattress on the floor, with my stuff scattered around it like I dropped my life from waist height. A hoodie on the chair. Socks near the plug socket. Toiletries lined up on the bathroom sink, like I'm staying in a motel. Every night I tell myself I'll unpack properly tomorrow, and every morning I step over the same mess and act surprised it's still there. The new job is fine, at least on paper. I made it through the mandatory induction without nodding off, which I counted as a win. I'm 21, a web designer at a small engineering firm, and on my first day, I quickly learned I'm not exactly surrounded by people who share my interests. My counterpart, the person who's supposed to work with me, is off sick, and from the way people talk about it, it doesn't sound like they're coming back anytime soon. The only person who's really in my orbit is my boss, Gary, who's in his 60s, and acts like computers are a wild animal you have to stare down until they behave. Gary arrives each morning already making noises like the building offended him. He does this loud, rough, gum morning to anyone within range, even if they don't answer, and then he sits down and loads the company website like he's checking on a patient. He refreshes it, clicks on About Us, refreshes it again. He watches the screen for a few seconds, then slaps his thighs like he's completed important work and announces it's coffee time. Would I like one? No? Okay then. And off he goes to the kitchenette, where he stays for ages, talking at whoever is unlucky enough to be within earshot, telling the same stories with the same punchlines, like he's testing the room for weakness. There isn't much pressure, and there isn't much challenge. Most of the time I'm fixing small things, updating text, adjusting images, waiting for someone to remember I exist. I should be grateful, and maybe I am. I needed steady more than I needed exciting. Because even before my ex cheated on me, I could feel my life starting to bend in ways that made me nervous, like the foundations were creaking under the weight of everything I wasn't saying out loud. I have trouble blending in. I get panic attacks that show up out of nowhere, like my body decides it's being hunted even when I'm just standing in line somewhere. People tell me I look angry a lot, even when I'm not. I think it's just my face when I'm concentrating, or when I'm trying to figure out if someone is joking or being serious. I'm not great at that. And I know my long hair doesn't help. And neither does the fact that my main hobbies are metal music, gaming, and combat sports. A lot of people see that combination and decide they already know what kind of person I am. So I told myself this move was a reset, a clean start, new town, new job, new routine. No baggage. I joined a gym, forced myself to go even on days I didn't feel like it, and started doing that thing where you nod at the same faces over and over until it almost becomes friendship. I went to a nature festival at the town hall and listened to people talk about leaves and soil and the healing properties of local plants for an hour. They weren't bad people. They were just not my people. There were drinks afterward, and I stood there holding a warm beer, watching groups form naturally around shared interests I didn't have. Everyone seemed either older, sporty, or outdoorsy in a way that made me feel like an intruder. At some point, I took a big swallow of the warm beer, and I felt a small shift inside me. Not courage exactly, but a thought that snapped into place like a puzzle piece. Alcohol was the key, not in a sad way, not in a drink your problems away way, just in a simple, practical way. I needed something to smooth the sharp edges off my brain long enough to talk without overthinking every word. I left my drink on a table and walked home, back in my apartment, with my air mattress and my camping chair and my half-started life. I opened Facebook and started scrolling like I was hunting. I needed something designed for people like me, people who didn't already have a circle. Something with rules and a reason to talk to strangers. That's when I found it, a local event called something like a group social for people aged 21 to 30. The description was cheerful and basic, the kind of thing that tries hard not to scare anyone off. It said it was a friendly meetup for people new in town, or locals who wanted to expand their circles. The location was Mackenzie's Irish Pub, which I knew was only a short walk away. The date was Friday, April 10th, 2026, and it started at 7 p.m. It had a small number of people marked as going, and a handful more interested. It felt like a sign, or at least it felt like the kind of opportunity you regret not taking, especially if you spend most of your time alone. Thursday dragged. Friday took forever. Gary did his usual morning routine, grunting and refreshing the company page like he expected it to change on its own. I made myself act normal at work, but inside, I felt like there were moths in my stomach. The worst part of social events isn't being there. It's the lead-up, The hours where your brain is free to imagine every possible way it could go wrong. When I got home, I ate pasta and deliberately left the garlic out because I didn't want to be the guy who shows up smelling like a kitchen. I stood in front of my clothes rail and stared at what little I'd bothered to hang up. I didn't want to look like I was trying too hard, and I also didn't want to look like I didn't care. In the end, I went with my default gray baggy jeans, green flannel, black etnies. I untied my hair and let it fall loose because it felt more like me, even if it made me look like a walking stereotype. On the walk to Mackenzie's, I started sweating, and it wasn't because it was cold. By the time I got to the pub door, my heart was thumping hard enough that I could feel it in my throat. I paused outside and took a few deep breaths that came out ragged anyway. My palms were damp. My head had that dull pounding pressure that comes with anxiety, the feeling that you're already exhausted before anything has even happened. I clenched my fists, released them, and tried to tell myself it would be okay once I had a beer or two. That thought got me through the door. Mackenzie's was darker and smaller than I expected, a cramped place with old wood, low lighting, and little alcoves branching off the main space, like corners designed for private conversations. It smelled like beer, cleaning solution, and something fried. The place wasn't packed. In fact, it looked almost empty, except for a small group gathered near the polished wooden bar. I hovered near the entrance for a second, trying to work out if I was in the right place. Nobody was wearing name tags. Nobody was waving a sign that said social meetup. It was just people standing around like they belonged. I picked a guy leaning against the jukebox and approached him because he was alone, which made him safer. He was short and stocky, with glasses and a beard that looked like it had been trimmed in a hurry. "Hey," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Is this the group meetup thing?" He looked at me like he was relieved I'd spoken first. "I think so," he said, "but I only just got here." Another person nearby overheard and nodded, confirming it. The two of us shared a small, awkward moment of relief, like soldiers realizing they'd ended up in the same unit. "I'm Mark," I said, offering my hand, because sometimes it helps to do the simplest social thing possible. He shook it firmly. "Short for anything?" "No." He grinned. "Because I'm Marcus." I wondered if we were basically named the same. "Oh," I said, and I actually smiled for real. "No, just Mark." Marcus pushed his glasses up his nose and widened his stance, like he was settling in. "Think I've heard of Mark," he said. "You new in town?" I nodded. "Yeah." "Same," he said, and then he looked me up and down in a way that somehow didn't feel insulting. He scratched his beard and smiled wider. "You're a metal guy, aren't you?" I laughed. "How can you tell?" He gestured at me like I was an obvious clue. The hair, the clothes, and the expression. "You look like one of those big stone heads. Like an Easter Island statue, tortured, sad, like you're thinking about something heavy." I try to camouflage a bit. He opened his hands, inviting me to inspect his outfit. A black cardigan buttoned up over a gray t-shirt, jeans that were slightly too long, Nike sneakers that looked like they'd been through a war, dirty and unlaced, with the denim at the heel frayed into threads. "So you're one of us," I said. "Just undercover." "Exactly," he said, pleased. "Favorite band?" That was all it took. He bought me a drink, and suddenly the night started moving. We talked about bands, Gojira, Avenged Sevenfold, Mastodon, and it didn't feel forced. It felt like talking to someone you'd already known online for years and finally met in person. He surprised me by bringing up MMA, and we went down that rabbit hole too, naming fighters most people had never heard of, arguing about who had the best ground game, who had the best chin, who the greatest of all time really was. For the first time since I'd moved, my shoulders relaxed without me having to consciously tell them to. After a while, I said it was my round. Marcus told me he wasn't picky, just not the absolute cheapest beer. I'm not classy, he said, but I don't drink stuff that tastes like regret. Then he clapped me on the back and headed toward the bathroom. As I walked to the bar with my wallet out, I realized I was smiling, a real smile, not a polite one. It felt strange on my face, like a muscle I hadn't used in a while. I looked around at the other people from the meetup, and for the first time I thought, maybe I can do this. Maybe it won't be a disaster. Maybe the whole fresh start thing could actually work. That's when a man slid up next to me. He had a shaved head and a faded brown leather jacket, broad shoulders, square jaw, the kind of guy who looked built for standing still and taking up space. "Hey," he said, leaning in like we were already friends. "My girlfriend saw you from across the bar, and we really dig your vibe. Can we buy you a drink?" I blinked, confused. "Pardon? We like you," he said, as if he was offering me a deal. "Can we get you something?" I started to say no again, but then I saw her. She was sitting on a bar stool like she belonged on it, dark eyeliner winged out from eyes that seemed too focused, too hungry. Black hair, cut into a neat bob that framed a heart-shaped face. A small hoop in one nostril. She was petite and lean, and she wore a short denim skirt and a tight red top that looked almost alive in the dim light. She leaned forward, resting her chin on her fist, and when her eyes met mine, the room felt smaller. "Our treat," she said, and her voice was smooth in a way that made my brain go quiet. She turned to the bartender without waiting for my answer. "A tequila soda with a squeeze of lemon and 2 beers, please." I should have stepped back. I should have checked if Marcus was coming out of the bathroom. I should have done a dozen sensible things. Instead, I stood there like an idiot and let the moment happen to me. Thanks," I managed. "I'm Mark." "Evelyn," she said, and she held out a hand with neat manicured nails. I shook it, and for a second I had the stupid thought that I should kiss her hand, like some old movie. She had a kind of confidence my ex never had. My ex always made me feel like I was too much, or not enough, depending on the day. Evelyn looked at me like I was exactly what she wanted. I turned to the man to introduce myself, but he was already gone, like he'd stepped out of existence, while I was distracted. "That's Jan," Evelyn said casually, following my gaze. "He's gone for a smoke." The drinks arrived quickly. She hopped down from her stool, moved closer, and I caught her perfume properly then. It smelled like cherries, and something darker underneath, something spicy and sharp. It made me think of trouble in the way you think of it when you're young. Exciting, not dangerous. "Do you smoke, Mark?" she asked. "I don't. Not really. Not at all." But I heard myself say, "Sure." I picked up the beers and followed her outside to the fenced smoking area. It was damp out, fine rain drifting down, the air smelling like wet pavement and cigarette ash. Jan stood a little way off, rigid and brooding, his cigarette glowing when he dragged on it. Evelyn walked over and handed him his beer. They exchanged a few words I couldn't hear. Then she came back to me, lighting my cigarette like she'd been doing it her whole life. "New in town?" she asked, exhaling smoke slowly. "Yeah," I said, trying not to cough. "You?" "No," she said. "We're locals. Things get stale after a while, you know? We thought we'd come to this meetup and see if we found someone who matched our vibe." She put a hand flat on my chest like it was the most natural thing in the world, and she winked. "Our kind of person. Our freak, if you know what I mean." Heat crept up my neck. I glanced over at Jan. He didn't look jealous. He just watched, blank and still. "You're together, right?" I asked, because my brain needed the words. "Yeah," she said easily. "But you can have me. He won't mind." "I have to be honest," I said, trying to keep my voice normal. "I came here to make friends. Am I not your friend?" she said, and she pouted like a child, but her eyes didn't match the expression. They were too sharp. "I didn't say that." She swung an arm around the back of my neck and pulled my head down against her chest, like she owned me. "Then come be friends at my place," she whispered into my ear. Her breath was warm. "Just you and me." My thoughts got messy. I lifted my head, and it felt like I was breathing her in. She cupped my cheeks, pulled my mouth down to hers, and kissed me. The kiss didn't feel romantic. It felt like being pulled. When we broke apart, she bit her lip and took my hand. The rain thickened as we stepped out onto the street. She led me fast, like she already knew I wouldn't stop her. Behind us, I saw Jan's dark shape following at a distance, cigarette ember flashing each time he took a drag. My heart was thumping again, but now it wasn't just anxiety. It was adrenaline, confusion, something else I didn't know how to name. We reached her apartment building and ran up a spiral staircase that smelled like old paint and damp stone. She fumbled with her keys, got the door open, and pulled me inside. We moved through the living room like it wasn't even there, crashing into the bedroom and into each other, hands grabbing, mouths meeting. Everything happening too fast. I heard the front door open again, then close. "Does he get involved?" I asked, breathless, my voice sounding small in my own ears. Evelyn smiled. "Do you want him to?" "Not really," I said. "And I meant it. He can sit out there and listen," she said, like she was offering a compromise. "He likes that." I hesitated, but she was already pulling her top off, tossing it aside like it didn't matter. She glanced toward the living room and raised her voice. "You hear that, baby?" From somewhere out there, Jan answered, calm and almost bored. "Go wild in there, you two." Then I heard the click of a remote and the low drone of a TV show starting up, as if this was just another night for them. Something about that hit me wrong. Not just the weird relationship dynamic, the casualness of it. Like I wasn't a person, just an event. Suddenly, I felt self-conscious in a way that made my skin itch. I muttered an excuse and stepped into the en-suite bathroom. I used the toilet, splashed cold water on my face, and leaned toward the mirror. My eyes looked too wide. My cheeks were flushed. I tried to tell myself to relax, to enjoy it, to stop being weird. Then the light in the room shifted. Not like a bulb flickering, like something moved across it, a shadow passing where it shouldn't. I turned and looked through the narrow gap between the door hinge and the frame. "Evelyn?" I whispered. The TV glow painted the living room in a weak blue light. The bedroom door was open. Evelyn was on the bed, but she wasn't moving like someone having fun. She was writhing like she was in pain, like something inside her was trying to get out. The sheets twisted under her hands. Jan stepped into the bedroom doorway. He looked down at her with a face that had no surprise in it at all. He didn't help. He didn't reach out. He just watched, solemn and steady, like a man attending something he'd seen many times. Then I heard sounds I will never forget. Bones snapping, wet tearing sounds, a thick gurgle-like fluid moving where it shouldn't. Evelyn convulsed, and her body began to change in ways my brain couldn't accept fast enough. Her head folded inward, not like a normal injury, but like it was collapsing into itself, opening into a dark, toothed space where a face had been. Her arms twisted. Her hands warped into small, fleshy claws, then hardened and reshaped into pincers. Her spine arched the wrong way, a horrible reverse curve that made her torso look less human with every second. Her legs drew together, merging into a flailing mass that sharpened at the end into something like a stinger. She wasn't becoming ugly in a simple way. She was becoming something else entirely. Something with sections, plated and potted, with new joints and appendages that didn't belong on a mammal. A thing built to crawl and pierce and feed. The red top and denim skirt were still there in pieces, stretched and tearing, ridiculous scraps on a body that wasn't a body anymore. I drifted out of the bathroom without realizing I was moving. I felt pale, drenched in cold sweat, my mouth open like I couldn't find the right amount of air. My cigarette smoke cough came back, and it sounded loud. Jan turned his head slightly and looked directly at me. "She'll have you now," he said, like he was telling me the weather. He stepped forward and shoved me back into the bedroom. Something splashed onto the back of my neck, hot and burning like acid mucus. I made a sound I didn't recognize as mine and lurched forward, slamming into Jan with everything I had. We crashed into the living room, grappling on the floor, fists and elbows in panic. He was stronger than he looked. He straddled me and pinned me with his arms planted on either side of my head. His face close, his breath smelling like beer and smoke. I bucked my hips, drove my knees up, and he pitched forward just enough. Instinct took over. I grabbed his right forearm with my mouth and bit down as hard as I could. I felt skin give way. I tasted blood, metallic and warm. Jan screamed, a real scream, and I used that second to wrench myself free. I scrambled for the door, my hands slipping on the floor, my sockless feet sliding. Behind me I heard it, the skittering of legs on hardwood, fast and heavy, like a big insect moving at full speed. The vibrations traveled through the floor and up into my bones. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I flung the door open and launched myself into the stairwell, half falling down the first steps. I slammed the door behind me just as something hit it from the inside. The wood shook. A stinger, thick and long, punched through the door like a blade, splintering it. On the other side, I heard a shriek, and the wet snapping of jaws closing on empty air. Furious, there was no flesh there to bite. I ran down the spiral staircase wearing nothing but my jeans, my shirt gone, my shoes gone, my neck burning where the hot slime had hit me. The rain outside felt like needles. The street was blurred and empty. My breath tore in and out of me. I didn't stop until I was back at Mackenzie's, pounding on the window like a madman. Marcus saw me first. He rushed over, alarmed, taking in my half-naked state and the red burn on the back of my neck, and the way I was shaking so hard my teeth clicked. I tried to explain, but the words came out wrong. All I could say was, "Scorpions, scorpions, scorpions," and I could hear how insane it sounded, even as I said it. Marcus didn't laugh. He swore under his breath, pulled out his phone, and called an ambulance. People in the pub stared. Someone asked if I'd been mugged. Someone else tried to hand me a jacket. I couldn't focus on any of it. Every time the door to the pub opened, I flinched, expecting Jan's blank face or Evelyn's new shape to come crawling in. The emergency room was bright, sterile, and slow. The harsh lights and the smell of disinfectant forced my brain into a different mode, like reality was snapping back into place, one uncomfortable piece at a time. Nurses asked me questions. I answered them badly. I sat in a plastic chair with a thin blanket around my shoulders and watched the clock move like it was stuck in syrup. I hate hospitals. I hate being looked at like I'm a problem. I hate the way time stretches there. Eventually, sometime in the early hours, I got a cab back to my place. The driver kept glancing at me in the mirror, probably wondering what kind of night ends with a barefoot man in jeans and a burn on his neck. I didn't offer an explanation. I didn't have one that sounded sane. Once I was alone in my apartment, the silence hit me. The air mattress creaked when I sat down. My PC screen was black. My clothes lay where I'd left them. Nothing in my room looked like it belonged to a world where a woman could turn into a giant stingered thing and a man could calmly push me toward it like a sacrifice. That's when my brain gave me an answer it liked better. Drink spiking. That happens. You hear about it. Someone slipped something into my beer. Someone wanted to mess with me, maybe rob me, maybe just watch me panic. Maybe I wandered off with strangers, got myself into a situation, and my mind filled in the gaps with horror, because that's what panic does. In that version, there was no Jan, no Evelyn, no shape-shifting scorpion creature waiting in a bedroom, just a bad night, a drug, and my brain trying to protect itself by making a story out of fear. I clung to that idea all week. The days that followed were quiet, and I was grateful for it in a way that felt desperate. Every normal hour that passed put more space between that night and the present. The memory started to feel like a bad dream you can't fully shake, embarrassing and sticky. I went to work. Gary did his morning routine. I nodded at people in the hallway. I pretended I wasn't constantly checking over my shoulder. I tried to laugh at myself for being stupid enough to follow a stranger home. By the weekend, I almost believed the spiked drink explanation completely. Then Monday arrived. I put on my work polo, tied my hair back, slung my laptop bag over my shoulder, and headed for the front door with that flat feeling you get at the start of a work week. Another Monday, another small mark on the wall of a life that was starting to feel like a long sentence. That's when I saw the envelope. It was a yellow envelope, slid neatly under my door like it belonged there. My stomach dropped so hard it felt like missing a stair step. I set my bag down slowly. My fingers were trembling as I picked the envelope up, like my body already knew what my mind was still refusing to accept. Inside was a card. The handwriting was clean, casual, almost playful. It said, "Dear Mark, great to meet you the other night. We'll see you around. Love from your friends, Jan and Evelyn, XXXX." I stood there in my doorway, holding the card, the apartment suddenly feeling too small and too exposed. My air mattress and camping chair and scattered belongings didn't look Spartan anymore. They looked temporary, like I'd never really moved in at all, like I was only borrowing the space until something came to collect me. Story 3. I need help. Seriously. Apparently, I can talk to the dead. Or at least I can talk to one dead guy. He is sitting in my living room right now, propped up like someone tried to decorate with a corpse and gave up halfway through. He tilts a little to the left, like a cheap parade float that's losing air. And he has been complaining for the last 40 minutes about how his son-in-law installed a ceiling fan wrong in 2009. Not it was annoying at the time either. More like the whole thing is still an active case file, and he expects me to take action. I am running out of patience, and I don't know what I'm supposed to do with that. That's why I'm posting here. I don't have anywhere else to go with this. You all deal with strange stuff. I'm not expecting a perfect answer, but I'm hoping at least somebody will take me seriously, or point me in a direction that isn't admit yourself to a psych ward and also confess to a felony. At this point, I'll take advice, theories, a priest's phone number, or even just someone telling me I'm not the only person who's ever had a dead roommate. The only other person I can talk to about this is the dead roommate himself, and he is not what you'd call neutral. I'm going to give as much context as I can, because I have no clue what details matter and what details don't. I'm also going to avoid anything that could identify me, for obvious reasons. I never thought I'd have to say that sentence, but here we are. Up until recently, my life was quiet on purpose. I'm 32. I've had serious social anxiety for as long as I can remember. And I don't mean the normal, I don't like public speaking thing people joke about. I mean the kind where your throat tightens up when someone asks you a simple question. The kind where you stand in Walgreens, typing out a full script on your phone about what you're going to say to the cashier, rehearse it 3 times in your head, and still mess it up. Ordering pizza feels like a hostage negotiation, where I'm both the hostage and the negotiator. I hate being perceived. I hate being looked at. It's exhausting. When I was growing up, my parents' idea of mental health care was telling me to toughen up. So I tried. I got good at staying small. I learned to keep my head down, speak only when I had to, and fade into the background like furniture. I never learned how to make friends in a normal, easy way. I had a few when I was younger, but they moved away for work, or for relationships, or just because they were brave enough to leave. I don't blame them. Staying in touch feels like it takes energy I don't have, and even when I want to reach out, I overthink it till I don't do it at all. I'll write a text, leave it in drafts for days, reread it, hate every word, and delete it. It has been years since I had a real conversation with any of them. I still live in the same small town I grew up in. I work at the same hospital where I was born. That part isn't poetic, it's just sad in a plain way. I work night shifts as a CNA, helping patients who are too old or too sick to take care of themselves. I'm actually good at the job. There's something quietly meaningful about being useful when someone is at their lowest. And night shift fits me. Most people are asleep or too tired to talk, which means fewer forced conversations and fewer chances for my brain to short circuit. Outside of work, my life is small and predictable. I keep to myself. I scroll through the same 3 apps until my eyes blur. I microwave the same frozen meals. I rewatch shows I've already seen because new things require attention and attention requires energy. Days disappear without me really noticing. I come home to an empty apartment, eat something depressing like Salisbury steak that tastes like salt and regret, and fall asleep to the glow of my laptop. I told myself it was fine, not great, but fine. At least it was stable. Then I met Earl. He was admitted about a month before he died. 70s, heart issues. The doctors sounded cautiously hopeful for a while, until they stopped sounding hopeful the way they do when the numbers stop cooperating. I'd talked to him a couple of times, nothing deep. He liked old westerns. He talked about his grandkids. He complained about the food. He asked me questions about my life, and I answered the way I always do, brief but polite, like I'm trying not to invite follow-ups. He seemed like an ordinary sick old man, the kind of patient you see, and you can tell, with that sad professional distance, probably won't be there much longer. You don't dwell on it. You do your tasks, keep them comfortable, and you move on. That's how you survive in that job. 2 weeks ago, I was in his room with my back to him, checking his IV bag. He was talking, mid-story, something about a dog he had as a kid, or a neighbor, or maybe a dog that bit a mailman. I wasn't really listening. I was doing what I always do at work, which is function on autopilot and try not to be emotionally involved. Then I heard this wet rattle sound, and then nothing. The monitor did that long, flat beep, the one you can feel in your teeth. Code blue. The room filled with people in seconds. Doctors, nurses, everyone moving fast and loud, like an emergency is a kind of dance they've practiced. I stepped back automatically, trying to make myself invisible, trying to be part of the wall. I watched them work on him, chest compressions, numbers being called out, hands moving with desperate routine, and I felt that heavy stillness you get when you realize you're watching a life exit a body. I had seen sick people. I had seen suffering, but I hadn't seen someone die right in front of me. It hit harder than I expected. It felt unfair how sudden it was. It felt stupid and undignified that a whole human life could end like that in a cold room, while strangers shoved on his ribs and alarms screamed. I was frozen. And then I heard Earl's voice. "What's this broad poking at my ribs for?" he snapped. I spun around so fast my neck hurt. For a stupid second, I thought they'd gotten a pulse back, like maybe I'd imagined the whole thing and he was alive and angry. But his body was still there on the bed, eyes glassy, mouth slack, and the monitor was still screaming. The doctors were still working. Nothing had changed, except I could hear him. Clear as day. "Are you people deaf or just stupid?" he barked, louder, annoyed, like he was being inconvenienced. I made a noise that I can only describe as a kettle dying. One of the nurses glanced at me. "You okay?" I mumbled something about thinking I heard him speak, and she gave me that gentle look people give when they're trying not to insult you. It's just the body reacting, she said. Sometimes you hear air move. It happens. I didn't tell her that I could still hear him, that he was getting louder, that he was now doing a full angry rant about the circus in his room and how nobody had the decency to warn him before setting off the alarm like that. Nobody else reacted. They kept doing their jobs while Earl complained at full volume, and I stood there with my brain trying to decide between two horrible options. Either I was losing my mind, or I was hearing a dead man talk, and I couldn't explain either one to a supervisor. I like my job. If I'm going to be the guy who hears the dead, I'd at least like to be the guy who hears the dead with dental insurance. They worked on him for close to 20 minutes. Nothing helped. He was gone. They stopped, covered him, and wheeled him out while his voice kept going furious and offended, talking about lawyers and incompetence and bedside manner. I could hear him getting quieter as the gurney rolled down the hall, like a radio being carried away. Then the room was empty, except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the feeling that reality had cracked and I'd seen inside it. I always thought the paranormal, if it existed, would look like horror movies. A creepy kid, a shadow in the corner, a Ouija board. Not a grumpy 78-year-old man who died mad about customer service. The rest of my shift was a blur. I did everything I was supposed to do. Vitals, repositioning, bedpans, charting, all while my body stayed tense, waiting for Earl's voice to show up again in some random room like a bad prank. Every time a call light went off, I jumped. I kept imagining I'd hear him shouting my name from a place he shouldn't exist. When I finally clocked out at 7 a.m., the sun was coming up, but it didn't feel comforting. It felt like a spotlight. I drove home with the radio off. The silence in my car felt thick, like pressure. I spent the next 14 hours in pure dread. I tried to sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face. I kept hearing a faint echo of him, complaining about the nurses. Not even scary, just constant, like my brain had been infected by an angry old man. By the time my next shift came around, the doubt was eating me alive. I couldn't focus. I couldn't think straight. I felt like I was watching myself from a distance, like I was slowly stepping out of my own life and into something worse. I needed proof. I needed to see the body again, hear nothing, and know this was stress or exhaustion or my brain finally snapping. My plan was simple. Go to the morgue, look at him, hear nothing, cry in my car like a normal person, finally call the therapist I've been avoiding for years. Earl's family wasn't local, so the hospital kept him in the morgue while arrangements were made. On my next shift, during that 2 a.m. lull when the whole building feels like it's holding its breath, I slipped down there. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my hands. He was there, cold, waxy, that strange bluish-gray tone skin gets when it's no longer a person, just matter. I reached out and touched his wrist. It felt like touching refrigerated meat. No pulse, no breath, no warmth, no voice. "Thank God," I whispered, and I actually laughed, just a little, like relief had escaped through my mouth before I could stop it. "You again," Earl shouted. "You got any mints? My mouth tastes like I've been chewing old socks." My whole body went cold. "Oh, no," came out of me, barely a sound. We talked for about half an hour down there, me whispering like a criminal, Him talking at a normal volume, because apparently shame is not a thing you feel after death. I kept looking at the door every 30 seconds, expecting security or a coroner to walk in and see me having a quiet conversation with a body drawer. I told him he was dead. He took it, as well as you can, I guess. He asked if he could get a second opinion. I told him I literally watched him die, so I felt pretty confident about the diagnosis. Bound to happen, he grumbled. Just thought there'd be more harps, or at least a buffet. I told him it seemed like I was the only one who could hear him. He asked if I'd ever considered becoming a detective, like this was a career opportunity. I didn't trust any of it, so I started asking questions about his life, details I could verify. I pulled out my phone right there and found his obituary. I cross-checked everything he said, his daughter's name, his old job, the little hobbies he mentioned, even some ridiculous detail about winning a trophy for roses in 2014. It was all there, down to names in the guest book from people I didn't know. I leaned back against the cold metal and whispered a tired, defeated, "Oh, God." "Language," Earl said automatically, like he could still report me to someone. I had to go back to work, and when I told him that, he panicked. He didn't want to be buried. He begged me to get him out of there. He didn't know why he could still talk. He didn't know why I could hear him. But he was terrified of being sealed in a box, underground, alone, in the dark with nobody to hear him. He said it like a scared kid, not like the angry guy from earlier. "Please," he said. "Kid, I don't want to be in there, not like that." And I pictured him screaming into velvet lining for years, decades, forever. A voice with nowhere to go. My anxiety was screaming no, but my mouth did something else. I'll think of something," I heard myself say. It took the rest of my shift for the full weight of that promise to hit me. When I got back to my car, I just sat there gripping the steering wheel until my hands hurt, staring at the hospital exit sign like it had answers. I remember thinking, very calmly, at what point did I become the main character in a horror movie? This is not how my week was supposed to go. What did I just agree to? I whispered to the empty passenger seat. Nothing answered. Not yet. Part of me still hoped I was imagining everything. I could have let him get buried like a normal person. I could have gone home and tried to forget this. But I kept thinking about him down there, aware and alone. I knew if I did nothing, I'd carry it forever, and I already carry enough. Stealing a body before burial would be impossible without someone noticing. That meant I'd have to wait until after the funeral, which meant I'd have to dig up a corpse. Great. Who does that? Weirdos? Criminals? People in old movies. I paced my apartment for hours, sweating, spiraling, arguing with myself. According to the burial notice, the funeral was Wednesday afternoon. That gave me one day to become the kind of person who digs. I went to the burial. I watched where they lowered him and took note of the plot while trying to look like a normal person who belonged there. The service was short and surprisingly crowded. I watched his family cry and hold hands and say goodbye, all while Earl argued with his own eulogy in my head, criticizing the wording, complaining that the pastor got his middle name wrong, correcting facts nobody could hear. That night, I drove to a hardware store 2 towns over and bought a shovel. I paid cash. I wore a hat. I don't know why I wore a hat. Like there's some universal rule that if you're buying a shovel for a crime, You should also dress like a suspicious cartoon. The whole drive to the cemetery, I told myself I would come to my senses. I'd park, take one look at the place, and go home. That would be the moment my brain snapped back to reality, and I'd laugh about this later with a therapist. I did not turn around. When I parked, I climbed out with a bag on my shoulder and a shovel in my hand, dressed like a man who absolutely should not be outside after midnight, carrying those items. The cemetery gate was locked. I almost took it as a sign. I stood there staring at it, thinking, okay, good. This is where it ends. This is the universe stepping in. Then Earl spoke, loud in my head, impatient, like he'd been waiting all day. I climbed the fence. I landed badly in the wet grass and almost fell on my face. Something rustled nearby and I froze, heart in my throat, convinced I'd been caught. A raccoon sat on a headstone and stared at me like I was disappointing. I stared back. We both silently agreed to ignore each other. I found Earl's plot. My shovel hit the dirt. Digging was awful. Worse than I expected, and also exactly as bad as I expected. It's hard, physical work, and it feels wrong in your bones the entire time. My lungs burned, my hands blistered, sweat ran down my face into my mouth. The dirt was still loose enough that I could move it, but not loose enough to make it easy. I kept stopping to listen for footsteps. Before I even got through the top layer, Earl's voice got louder, like he was closer now, like the ground was acting like a speaker. When I finally reached the casket, I worked the lid loose with shaking hands and pulled it open. It was unlocked. I guess they assumed the dead usually behave. You came, Earl said, bright and genuinely happy, and something complicated tightened in my chest. Then he added, "Did they put too much rouge on me?" I told my daughter no rouge. "I'm not looking at you," I hissed. "I'm committing a crime." "Just a quick look," he said. 2 seconds. I looked. There was a lot of rouge. "Yeah," I admitted quietly. "I knew it," Earl said. Satisfied, I wrapped him in a tarp, trying not to think too hard about what I was doing. I lifted with my legs like OSHA would want, even though I'm pretty sure OSHA doesn't have guidelines for hauling a corpse out of a grave. I filled the hole back in fast and messy, then tried to make it look normal, smoothing the dirt and replacing what I could so it didn't look freshly disturbed. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. I kept imagining a flashlight beam sweeping over me, a voice calling out, a gun cocking. None of that happened. The night just watched. I hauled him to the fence in awkward bursts, stopping every few seconds to listen. The tarp made him look like a badly wrapped piece of furniture. "Take your time," Earl said, cheerful, not like I've got anywhere else to be. I got him into the back of my car and drove home at exactly the speed limit like a saint. Every red light felt like an interrogation. Every passing headlight felt like a police car. I kept thinking I would get pulled over and have to explain why my trunk contained something shaped like a person. At 2 a.m., my neighbor's doorbell camera watched me drag what looked like an oddly shaped couch cushion through the front door. Inside my apartment, I sat Earl upright on my couch, like the world's worst throw pillow. Then I sat in my kitchen and ate cereal, because I didn't know what else to do and my brain needed something normal to hold on to. I stared at the wall and had long, regretful thoughts about every choice that brought me to this moment. From the other room, Earl called out, "Do you have cable?" That was a week ago. Every morning I wake up convinced I'll walk into the living room and find a silent, dead body slumped on my couch. And I do find a dead body on my couch. But he's never silent. He's always talking, usually about how modern TV is trash, sometimes about the ceiling fan. Always with opinions. Here's the part that makes me feel even crazier. In a twisted way, it's been kind of nice. For the first time in years, I come home and someone asks about my day. He listens, he asks follow-up questions. He doesn't make me feel like I'm performing or auditioning for basic human approval. He's seen me at my worst now. There's no pressure to impress him. We're past that. I can just exist. He's loud and pushy and stubborn, but he's also the first person in a decade who won't let me fade into nothing. I've even gotten him to watch shows besides old westerns. He pretends he doesn't care about baking competitions, but he goes quiet during judging like he's holding his breath. He likes gin rummy. He cheats. Don't ask me how, because I don't know how a dead man cheats at cards, but he does it with the confidence of someone who's been doing it his whole life. But it's not all heartwarming ghost grandpa bonding. There are problems. Huge problems. Life-ending problems. The first one is the smell. I cannot stress this enough. The smell is destroying my life. If you've ever wondered what it would be like to live inside a dumpster full of raw chicken left out in the sun, with someone occasionally spraying a hopeful puff of linen fresh air spray into the air like that will fix it, that's the vibe. At first it was faint, like old food in the back of a fridge. Then it grew. It bloomed. By day 4, it had soaked into everything. The couch has absorbed it like a sponge. My curtains smell like death. My clothes smell like it even after I wash them. I can shower, put on clean clothes, and within an hour, it's like the odor crawled back onto me. I've tried everything short of setting the building on fire. Strong odor removers just make it smell like chemical death instead of natural death. Baking soda everywhere makes my apartment look like a depressing crime scene. I bought a cheap air purifier and packed it with charcoal filters, but it just sits there humming like it's offended and exhausted. Nothing wins against decomposition. My neighbor, Gary, has started lingering in the hallway with this suspicious squint. I told him I thought something died in the walls, which is technically not a lie if you don't think about it too hard. He nodded slowly, like he didn't believe me, but also didn't want to ask. If I can't solve the smell, I am going to lose my mind. I'm also going to get caught, because the smell is not subtle, it's an announcement. The second problem is that Earl does not sleep. Ever. Which means I have no privacy. None. Not even a little. There is always an audience now. Even when he's watching TV, I can feel him listening. I'm just going to leave that there. The third problem is that he has opinions about everything and he will not stop sharing them. The weather, my snack choices, how I breathe, where my furniture is, the way I load the dishwasher. If I had known death didn't stop someone from backseat driving, I would have prepared myself. And there's a new thing happening that I don't like thinking about. It started small, twice now, while watching TV. My arm has twitched hard, not a little muscle twitch, a full jerk like a reflex. Once it happened when someone on a cooking show said something rude about pot roast. Another time it happened during a Gunsmoke episode, when a deputy did something Earl didn't like. Both times I looked at Earl. He was still, staring at the screen. But something about the angle of him felt smug. like he knew. The second time, I asked him straight out, "Did you do that?" He paused. "Do what?" "My arm. Arms do things," he said. "That's what they're for." I dropped it because I didn't have a good answer and I really didn't want to open the door to whatever that conversation becomes. I've tried to approach this like a normal person, like a scientist, like someone who needs proof that they aren't hallucinating. I'll leave the apartment, come back, ask Earl what I missed in an episode, and then check online. He's always right. I fact-checked his life story too. I even drove past his old house once, which made me feel like a total creep. But I needed to know. Every detail matched. Even the crooked little library box by the curb that his son-in-law built. Earl complained about that thing for 10 minutes, and it was there, leaning exactly the way he described. I also tried to rule out the obvious horror movie option. I needed to know if he was something else pretending to be Earl. So yes, I did the dumb thing where you test for demons after you've already committed crimes for the entity and invited it into your home. Because I am apparently learning life lessons in the wrong order. The Vatican has an online gift shop. I wish I was joking. I ordered little vials of holy water that were supposedly blessed by the Pope, because at that point I was willing to try anything. I poured them into a spray bottle and misted Earl while he was distracted by gun smoke, expecting screaming. Smoke, melting, anything dramatic. He didn't react at all. "I'm not a plant," he said, annoyed, like I'd sprayed him with a water bottle for scratching the couch. I told him I was testing if he was a demon. He stared at me. "With a spray bottle?" "Yes. I'd know if I were a damn demon," he said. "Would you tell me?" I asked. He paused. Fair point. Since I'd already gone that far, I pulled out the cross I'd also bought, mostly because I needed to hit a minimum amount for free shipping. I tried reading instructions from some online how to banish a demon guide on my phone. Nothing happened. I held the cross up. I touched him with it. I even hung it around his neck. He said it was kind of stylish. So either he's actually Earl and Catholic tools don't apply here, or he's something worse, and I'm screwed. I tried burning sage too, but it set off my smoke alarm. My neighbor showed up pounding on the door, and I had to yell through it that I was cooking, which didn't sound believable even to me. Then there's the question of unfinished business. This one seemed reasonable at first. A lot of ghost stories revolve around it, but Earl has turned the idea into a weapon. By any normal measure, he had a decent life, family, career, grandkids. He said what needed saying, no huge regrets, no obvious unfinished business. But whenever I tell him I can't do something, he gets this thoughtful look and says, "Maybe that's what's keeping me here." Like my refusal to drive him past his old house on a Tuesday to check if the new owner is watering the hydrangeas correctly is the thing blocking his path to the afterlife. I tell him that's not how unfinished business works. He asks how I know. I have to admit, I don't know. None of this has rules I can trust. So now I'm stuck with the real problems, the ones I can't ignore. I need to know how to slow decomposition. I don't know how to keep him from turning my apartment into a biohazard. I've read about preservation, but I can't exactly take him to a funeral home and ask for help without answering questions that would put me in handcuffs. Earl keeps suggesting taxidermy, and he is way too excited about it. He said he'd love to have his head mounted on my wall like a deer. He said it like it was a fun decorating idea. He also keeps calling his eyes his baby blues, which is upsetting because right now they look like overripe grapes. This leads to another horrible thought I can't stop circling. How much of him is actually him? If I did something to the body, would it hurt him? Would it kill him? If I cremated the remains, would that free him, or would I just end up with a very loud cloud of opinions? We've talked about the idea of small experiments, controlled tests, tiny changes to see what happens. I hate even thinking about it. The thought makes me nauseous, but time is not on my side. He is rotting. My apartment is becoming unlivable. I even caught myself thinking something like, if I removed an eye and he could still see somehow, that would prove something. And then I felt like I needed to sit down, because that is not a normal thought to have about any person, dead or alive. I also keep wondering if it's just Earl, or if I could talk to other dead people too. Testing that would mean digging again, which I am not willing to do. I already crossed one line that I never thought I'd cross. I can't become the guy who does it repeatedly. But if I can hear others, do I have a responsibility to? That idea scares me. The thought of other people like Earl being aware, trapped, alone underground with nobody able to hear them, makes my stomach turn. I hate that I'm also curious, because curiosity is what gets people killed in every story I've ever read. And there's another layer to this that I didn't come up with. Earl did. He keeps bringing up cold cases, people who died without names, people nobody could identify. He says I could help them. He says I could give them a voice. He says maybe this is some kind of gift from God. I hate how tempting that idea is, because it feels insane, but it also feels like it could be true. If a victim could tell me who they were, or who hurt them, that could matter. There have been murders not far from here. If someone could speak from the dead and name their killer, it would change everything. But Earl isn't the one who would have to deal with police attention, courtrooms, news cameras, suspicion, or the simple fact that I dug up a body and it talked to me is not going to play well in any official setting. He also isn't the one who has to manage the consequences if I find more like him. Because if there are other dead people who can talk, and they realize being dug up means not being alone in a box, why would they agree to be buried again? I can barely handle one decomposing roommate. I don't have the space, the money, the emotional strength, the legal cover, or the spiritual knowledge to run a halfway house for chatty corpses. I cannot have more of them. I'm not equipped for that in any way. I know I should have a plan. I know I'm behind on every smart decision a person could make, but it's hard to plan when your starting point is, there is a dead man on my couch, and he has strong feelings about television. Reburying him feels cruel, and he's completely against it. Leaving him as is unsustainable. And the worst part is, he's starting to grow on me, which I am not proud of, and I am absolutely not letting him know, because if he realizes I care even a little, I will never have peace again. So that's everything. I know it's a lot. I need suggestions, general paranormal advice, practical next steps, ways to handle whatever this is. Ways to deal with a roommate who never sleeps, never leaves, and is actively melting into your furniture. And please, if nothing else, tell me what to do about the smell, because that part is going to get me caught even if the rest of this somehow stays secret. Also, Earl says to tell you that Gunsmoke is a classic, and you all have bad taste. He laughed so hard when I read this back to him that for a second his whole body tilted farther left, and I had to steady him like a haunted coat rack. And if his grandkids somehow read this online, I'm sorry I dug up your grandfather. In my defense, he was very demanding about it, and also, I am not handling any of this well. Story 4. When I was 16, my parents sent me to live with my grandparents for a month. I hadn't been out there in years. The last time I'd visited, I was little enough to still think the countryside was charming instead of isolating. By 16, I was old enough to understand what my parents were really doing. We weren't getting along. Every conversation at home felt like a match near a gas can. They'd call me difficult. I'd call them controlling. We'd both act like the other person started it, and we'd both be right. So, they decided distance would fix it. A change of scenery, time away from my friends, my school, my routines. The middle of nowhere, with two elderly people who still called the living room the front room. They said it like it was going to be good for me, like clean air and quiet nights could heal whatever was wrong in our house. If I'm being honest, I think they mostly wanted me gone, a month where they could breathe without me in the room. A month where they could pretend they didn't have a kid who made them feel like failures. Whatever their reason, I went. I got tossed into the back seat with a duffel bag and a forced smile, and a few hours later the road turned to gravel, and the trees got thicker, and the houses got farther apart. My phone signal got weaker in little drops until it was hanging on by a thread. The sky felt too big. The land felt too empty. My grandparents' place sat at the end of a dirt road like it had been planted there and forgotten. The house was old, but sturdy, with faded siding and a porch that creaked even when no one walked on it. The yard was huge. All tall grass and weeds they probably used to keep trimmed back when they had more energy. There was a big oak near the front and a rusting swing set that looked like it hadn't been touched in a decade. My mom pulled up, dust rolling behind the SUV like smoke. She leaned out the window with her bright fake cheer, like she was dropping me off at summer camp and not exiling me. "Bye, sweetie." "Behave," she said, waving too hard. "Try to contain your excitement," I mumbled, not even bothering to hide how annoyed I was. I turned toward my grandparents, who were already on the porch waiting like they'd been counting down the minutes. Grandma's face lit up when she saw me. She had that warm, open smile that made you feel like you were doing her a favor just by existing. She walked down the steps with her arms out, and before I could dodge it, she hugged me tight. "Oh, Stephen," she said, like she was saying my name with her whole heart. "We are so happy you're staying with us." Her warmth was real. It was almost embarrassing how sincere it was. It made me feel guilty for being irritated. Pappy didn't say anything at first. He came down behind her slowly, bigger than I remembered. He wasn't tall exactly, but he was built like a man who'd spent his whole life lifting heavy things and never once complained about it. Thick arms, big hands, shoulders like a doorway. His face looked like it had been carved out of old wood, the kind of face that rarely softened. He didn't hug. He just put a heavy hand on my shoulder, firm, claiming. "She's right," he said. "We don't get many visitors." I managed a grin, even though inside I was screaming. I'd never been comfortable around him. He wasn't cruel in any obvious way, but he was stern and quiet, and he had this way of looking at you, like he was measuring you. When he spoke, It was final. When he got angry, the whole room seemed to adjust around it. "Happy to be here," I said, and I meant it in the way a hostage means it when they say they're fine. Grandma ushered me inside right away, like she'd been waiting to get me out of the sun. The house smelled like old wood, laundry soap, and something sweet baking somewhere deeper in the kitchen. Everything looked like it had been the same for decades. The furniture was covered in plastic runners and lace cloths. Family photos sat on every shelf. There were tiny decorations on the windowsills that looked like they'd never moved even to be dusted. Grandma took me upstairs to a small bedroom with a floral quilt and a dresser that probably weighed as much as my entire body. The curtains were thin, letting in pale light. The air felt still, like the room had been holding its breath since the last time someone slept in it. "Make yourself at home," she said, smoothing the blanket like she was preparing the bed for a guest of honor. "Dinner will be at 6. As soon as she left, and her footsteps faded down the stairs, I pulled my phone out like it was a life raft. I checked the screen. No service. I held it up, moved it around, walked to the window. One bar flickered on for half a second, and died again. My stomach sank. I tried turning airplane mode on and off like that would magically create a tower. Nothing. They didn't have Wi-Fi. Of course they didn't. My grandparents were old school in the worst possible way. They still used a landline. They still read the newspaper. They thought the internet was mostly scams and gossip. Every teenager's nightmare. I went downstairs, my footsteps loud in the quiet house. Pappy was sitting at the kitchen table with a crossword puzzle, wearing reading glasses that made him look even more severe. He didn't look up right away, just lifted a hand slightly like he knew I was there and expected me to state my business. "Hey, Pap," I said. He glanced up, the movement slow, his eyes sharp. He didn't smile. He just waited. My question suddenly felt stupid, like I was asking if they had a spaceship in the garage. I said, "Do you have internet out here?" He stared at me for a beat, like he was deciding how much respect I deserved. Then he nodded toward a bulky old computer monitor in the corner of the room, the kind that looked like it weighed more than a microwave. "That's all we got," he said. "No connection." My heart dropped so hard I felt it in my chest. It was going to be a long month. The first 2 days crawled by. Without my phone working, time didn't pass normally. I didn't realize how much I used it to break the day into pieces. Out there, the hours just stretched. Breakfast, chores, lunch, more chores, dinner, the news on TV, bed. Grandma was kind, always offering food, always trying to chat. Pappy mostly kept to himself, sitting in his chair, working on puzzles, watching old shows, going outside to check the property like he was guarding it. I tried reading, but my mind wouldn't settle. I tried helping Grandma in the kitchen, but she kept fussing over me and telling me I didn't have to do anything. I tried walking around outside, but the woods felt too quiet, like they were listening. On the 3rd day, I got bored enough to explore the house properly, not in a spooky adventure way at first, just in a restless, trapped way. I opened doors I hadn't opened. I looked into closets. I wandered down the hallway like I was looking for a hidden exit. That's how I ended up at the basement door. It was in the back of the house, off a narrow hallway that smelled faintly damp. The door itself was plain, but it had that old house vibe. where you could tell it had been there longer than you had. I opened it, and a cold, stale smell rolled out, like earth and dust, and something metallic. The basement steps creaked under my feet as I went down. The air got colder the lower I went. There was one light bulb hanging from the ceiling on a cord, and when I pulled it, the bulb flickered and came alive with a weak yellow light. The basement was exactly what you'd expect. Cobwebs in every corner, shelves stacked with old jars and tools, boxes of things no one used anymore. Everything was coated in dust thick enough to write your name in. It didn't feel welcoming. It felt like a place the house was trying to forget. And then I saw it. A door at the far end of the basement. Just one wooden door, standing by itself like it didn't belong. What stopped me wasn't the door at first. It was the note nailed to it. "Stay out, Pappy." The message wasn't cute, it wasn't joking, it was written like a command, and it was obviously meant for me. I stared at it, and my boredom turned into something else. Curiosity, sharp and immediate, the kind you can feel in your fingertips. If I'd been in my own house, I might have obeyed. But I was 16, angry at my parents, stuck in a place with no internet and nothing to do. That note might as well have been a neon sign that said, "This is the only interesting thing in the house." I walked toward the door, careful even though there was no reason to be. I didn't want to make noise. I didn't want to announce myself. My heart started beating faster, and a part of me felt excited, like I was stepping toward something forbidden, and that alone made it thrilling. I reached for the knob, took a breath, and turned it. Locked. Of course it was locked. The excitement drained out of me, replaced by irritation. I turned to leave, already thinking about what else I could do to entertain myself. And then I stopped. Someone was standing at the bottom of the stairs, blocking my path. Pappy. The color drained from my face so fast I felt dizzy. I hadn't heard him come down. I hadn't heard the basement door open. He was just there, filling the space, staring at me like he'd been waiting. "What are you doing down here?" he said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement with teeth. I was just looking around, I said, forcing a weak smile. My mouth felt dry. My throat tightened the way it always did when I was caught doing something wrong, like my body wanted to shut itself down. Pappy didn't move. He just glowered. His silence felt heavy. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and calm, which somehow made it worse. "Get out," he said. "I don't want to see you down here again." "Yes, sir," I said immediately. I didn't wait for another word. I squeezed past him and went up the stairs fast, not quite running but close. I could feel his eyes burning into the back of my head the whole way. That should have been enough to make me drop it. Any normal person would have taken that warning and left the basement alone. But now, I couldn't stop thinking about that door. Pappy wasn't hiding Christmas presents. He wasn't hiding old family photos. People didn't nail warnings to doors for harmless reasons. And if he didn't want me down there, it meant there was something he didn't want me to see. So I decided I'd go back. Just not right away. I wasn't stupid enough to test him again the next day. I told myself I'd wait until he went out to the store or ran errands. I'd go down, find the key, see what was inside, and lock it back up, like nothing happened. I thought I was being clever. I didn't realize I'd get a better chance, and a worse one, much sooner. That night, I woke up with the sudden need to pee. I stumbled out of bed half asleep, did what I had to do, then wandered into the kitchen for a glass of water. The house was quiet in that deep nighttime way where it feels like even the walls are sleeping. The only light came from the moon through the window and the faint glow of the stove clock. As I crept back toward my room, trying not to wake anyone, I heard a sound, a low rustling, somewhere deeper in the house. I don't know why I didn't just go back to bed. I should have. Any sane person would have, but something about the sound pulled me toward it. I crouched at the top of the landing, hidden in shadow, and listened. Footsteps moved across the floor below, slow, heavy. Then I saw it, the shadow of Pappy's frame passing through the darkness. He paused in the kitchen as if he'd sensed something. For a second, I was sure he'd look up and see me. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might give me away. But after a moment he continued, heading down the hallway. Then I heard a door creak open. The basement. A cold rush ran through my body, like my brain had already decided what this meant. I waited until his footsteps were on the stairs, then slipped down the steps from the landing as quietly as I could. Every board felt like it wanted to betray me. My hands were damp. My mouth tasted like fear. When I reached the main floor, the basement door was open, spilling faint light. I moved like I was sneaking through someone else's life. I went down the basement steps slowly, and halfway down, I froze and peered into the room. Pappy stood at the far end, near the hidden door. He moved with purpose, like this was routine. He went to an old painting leaning against the wall, dusty and forgotten, and reached behind it. He pulled out a rusted key. My stomach flipped. There it was. The key. Proof that what he was doing mattered. He put the key in the lock and turned it. The hidden door opened, and light spilled out from the room beyond, brighter than the basement bulb. For an instant, the angle was just right, and I thought I saw something dark on the floor inside. Crimson. It was only a flash, but it made my blood turn cold. I backed away before he could turn and catch me. I climbed the stairs silently, each step slow, and went to my room. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my ears ringing. I told myself it was nothing. A stain, paint, rust. My imagination making a horror story out of a shadow. But I didn't believe myself. Curiosity ate at me for the next day like something with teeth. It wasn't even fun anymore. It was obsession. I kept seeing that key in my mind. I kept thinking about what I'd seen on the floor. I knew where he kept the key now, behind that painting. But I wasn't dumb enough to try at night. He'd caught me once already in the basement like he had a sixth sense. I didn't want to find out what would happen if he caught me again, actually trying to get inside. So I stuck to my original plan. I waited until Pappy left the house. The next morning, he grabbed his keys from the hook by the door and grumbled something about milk. Grandma called after him in her sweet voice, telling him to be safe. He gave a grunt that counted as agreement and walked out. I watched him from the window until his truck disappeared down the dirt road. Then I moved. I put down the newspaper I'd been pretending to read and headed for the basement door. My heart was pounding already. I opened it slowly, wincing at every tiny creak. Grandma was in the kitchen, busy with a pie, humming to herself. Either she didn't hear me, or she didn't want to. I went down the basement steps fast, barely breathing. The bulb flickered on with that weak light, and the basement felt colder than before, like it knew what I was doing. I pulled the painting away from the wall and reached behind it. My fingers closed around the rusted key. I turned toward the hidden door. The warning sign was still nailed there. "Stay out. Pappy." It looked less like a note now and more like a threat. My hand shook as I put the key in the lock. I turned it. The lock clicked open, and the door swung inward. Nothing could have prepared me. The smell hit first, so thick and rotten it made my eyes water instantly. It wasn't the smell of a dirty basement. It wasn't mold. It was something sour and heavy, like meat left out too long, like something that had no business existing in a house. The floor was stained with dried blood, dark and crusted. It wasn't just one spot. It was everywhere in patches, like spilled paint that had soaked in. To my right was a metalwork table, the kind you'd see in a garage. Tools were laid out on it in neat rows. Pliers, hacksaws, hammers. They weren't clean. Their edges were crusted with flaky dark red. At the far end of the room, there was a corkboard, and my eyes locked onto it immediately because it looked so out of place. It was covered in newspaper clippings and photographs, missing person articles, faces, names, dates. Someone had pinned them up like trophies, like a collection. Some were old and yellowed. Some looked newer. The whole board felt like a map of people who'd vanished and never come back. And then I saw the mattress. A dirty yellowed mattress in the corner, like someone had dragged it down there and never bothered to cover it. And on top of it, a body, a corpse, decayed and exposed, with maggots writhing in places I couldn't look at for long. The eyes were wide open. The mouth was frozen in a shape that looked like a scream that never ended. My knees went weak. The room tilted. For a second I thought I might faint, and the idea of fainting in that room made me want to throw up. I stepped back, choking on the smell, my brain refusing to accept what my eyes were seeing. Then something behind me made a small sound. Click. I turned slowly, because I already knew. My body already knew. Pappy stood in the doorway with a gun in his hand. A six-shooter pointed at me like he'd been born holding it. His face was twisted in a way I'd never seen before. Not stern, not annoyed. Hate, pure hate, like I had ruined something precious. "Pappy," I managed, my voice thin. "I thought you were at the store. Forgot my wallet," he said, like it was nothing. Upstairs, I heard Grandma moving around, still humming faintly, still living in the version of the world where this room didn't exist. Pappy stared at me for a long moment, and then he sighed. Not tired, resigned, like he'd been hoping he wouldn't have to do this, but I'd forced his hand. "You've seen too much, boy," he said. I didn't want it to come to this. The gun fired. The sound was deafening in the small room. For a split second, I didn't feel anything. The adrenaline made everything distant and strange. Then I looked down and saw red spreading across my arm. A sharp, burning pain followed, blooming fast. "Upstairs!" Grandma shouted. "Arnold, what was that?" My mind latched onto her words. Arnold, his name. The fact she was calling down like this was normal? "Nothing," Pappy yelled back. "Ignore it." And then nothing. No footsteps. No panic. No screaming, just silence from upstairs. That silence was worse than the gun. How much did she know? How long had she known? Had she been pretending this whole time, smiling and baking pies while people disappeared? Pappy stepped closer, and the barrel of the gun lifted toward my head. He cocked the hammer with a calm, practiced motion. "Your grandmother's going to be upset when she finds out," he said, voice low. "But she'll get over it. Eventually." My heart slammed against my ribs. I stared at the gun, at his hands, at his face, and something inside me snapped from fear into survival. I moved before I could think. I lunged forward. The second shot went off as I moved, and I heard the bullet pass close enough that the sound itself seemed to slice past my ear. I shoved into him with everything I had. He stumbled, more surprised than hurt, and the gun slipped from his grip and clattered onto the basement floor. I didn't stop. I bolted up the basement stairs, pain screaming in my arm, my breath coming in ugly bursts. I hit the main floor, sprinted through the hallway into the foyer, and yanked the spare keys off the hook by the door with shaking fingers. Behind me, I heard him coming. Heavy footsteps pounding up from the basement, furious. "Get back here," he roared. I ran outside into the bright day, like it was a different planet. The air tasted sharp. The sun felt wrong. I sprinted across the yard toward his truck, my arms slick with blood, my hands slipping on the keys. The truck door opened on the second try, and I threw myself into the driver's seat. Pappy appeared in the doorway of the house, raising the gun again. The truck lurched forward as I slammed it into drive. A shot rang out. The left side mirror exploded, glass scattering, and I ducked instinctively, heart hammering. I didn't wait to see if he'd shoot again. I floored it down the dirt road, the tires kicking up dust, the truck rattling like it might fall apart. Pappy didn't chase me. He just stood there in the doorway, watching that hateful stare burning into me like a brand as the house got smaller in the mirror. I drove until I reached the nearest town, hands shaking so badly I could barely keep the wheel steady. The wound on my arm hurt like fire, but it was a graze, not a deep shot. Blood soaked my sleeve, but I wasn't dying. I went to the police. I told them everything, and I sounded insane, and I didn't care. I told them about the hidden room, the blood, the tools, the missing people board, the body, the gun. I showed them my arm. They took it seriously. They went to my grandparents' house with more cars than I'd ever seen in my life. They taped off the yard. They walked through the house with weapons drawn, calling out. They searched the basement. They found the door. They went inside. What they found there is something I still see in my head sometimes when I'm half asleep and my mind is unguarded. They found my grandparents' bodies in the home. The gun was still warm in Pappy's hand when they found him. That detail stuck with me because it made everything feel even more real, warm, recent. Like if I'd been a few minutes slower, I'd have been there too. After the investigation, my grandfather's crimes became public. It wasn't just one victim. It wasn't just some private horror buried in a basement. He was linked to 13 disappearances, and the police believed there could have been more. People came forward with stories about relatives who had vanished. Old rumors suddenly had proof. The town went from quiet to screaming overnight, and my grandparents' house became the kind of place people drove past slowly just to stare at it. I went to therapy for years after that. Not the casual kind. The kind you go to when you're trying to convince your body that you're safe, even though your brain knows you aren't. I had nightmares. I couldn't handle basements. I couldn't handle the smell of certain cleaning products because they reminded me of that room. I couldn't be alone in a quiet house without listening for footsteps. Even now, all this time later, the main thing I feel is a strange, exhausted kind of gratitude because I made it out alive. And some part of me still can't believe that sentence is true.